For those of you who are wondering who I am and why I'm standing up here this morning, a lot of reference has been made to the Unitate-funded RDT project that's looking at malaria rapid diagnostic tests in 5 markets. And I am the deputy director of that project. And the reason I'm up here is because we were able to utilize the funding from that project and an aligned donor who's very interested in market development to kind of test out some of the theory and the processes that we are outlining for you all in this workshop. So I'm speaking about the experience that we've had in our project and hopefully bringing to that a process for you all to use in your countries. So there are 2 steps in understanding the total market. This morning, I will talk about the first step, both in terms of theory or concepts behind that. It may seem obvious, but we've outlined an approach to really operationalize effectively how to map the market and some process considerations. And the second step within this step 2, so 2.2, is analyze the market landscape. So once we have our market mapped or landscaped, we need to start to bring a filter to that and start to analyze what it means, where are the pain points in the market, where are the market failures. So we can go to the next step in our process, which we'll be discussing tomorrow. So I'll take us through the process for mapping the market as we've developed it, and Fred will lead us through in the afternoon on analyzing the market landscape. There is a tendency when you map the market to immediately start to analyze it. We are all smart people, and as we're getting information in, and there's a lot of information in this process, the tendency is really to start to discern it. Oh, that's a pain point, that's a pain point, that's where the market is failing. And I think we have to be very cautious as we go through this process to really, at the first step, collect all the information and put it out there before we go into the analysis component. Okay, so let's talk about mapping the market. So there are 2 different components to this. Understand health market trends and describe the market performance and structure. The first one is pretty straightforward, understand health market trends. When we're talking about health market trends, we're talking about looking at key aspects of the market over time. How has the market evolved over time? This gives us a basic feel for the market, how it's looking, what's happened in the past several years. And we've broken out these components at a log frame level. At a goal level, we have issues around mortality and morbidity, disease incidence, and prevalence. But we also need to look at how the market has evolved over time at the output level. This is around behaviors, as we saw yesterday in our theory of change, use, and quality of use over time. And then at the output level, we want to consider the 4 Ps. How has the product changed over time? Have there been new introductions of technology? What has price done over time? Who are the major players in this market? Are there new manufacturers that have entered in the last few years? And have there been any major systems changes? Has health insurance suddenly come online and provided access to the service or products that we're talking about? These are all things that inform how we understand the market. And it's very important for us to understand them if we're going to work effectively in that market and know where it's failed. So just to give you a visual of that, this is an example from ACT Watch, which is a long-standing anti-malarial market survey. And the reason we put this up here is because we get trend level data from ACT Watch. So surveys collected starting in, here we have 2009 up through 2014. And the idea here is just to present to you that we can find health market trend data. It is out there in the literature and in the research. And it's important for us as we're embarking on understanding the market that we do this from an evidence-based perspective. And we'll talk more about the process by going through that in a second. But just to give you guys all a nice example of what trend level data looks like over time. Okay, so describe the market structure and market performance. So how do we do that rather than just read a bunch of stuff, bring our own understanding, and write a 40-page report, right? That's one way to map the market. It's one way to do a landscape. But I think we all know we've done situation analyses or market landscaping that produces a 40-page report that nobody reads, that maybe a consultant wrote. It sits in a shelf and has nothing to do with the projects we're implementing, right? So this process that we're going to outline is a way to make the mapping of the market real and to have it actually inform our interventions with a market development lens. So this is just a review from yesterday. This is how we understand the market. It's more than just demand and supply. It is about the supporting functions and the rules. But that's a theory or a concept or a framework. How do we take that and operationalize it to understand the market in which we are working? Again, we don't want just information about all these aspects of the market. We want information that allows us to make decisions. So, what we've done, and this is really under the courageous leadership of Yasmin and Nikki, is thought, how do we operationalize the market system? So some of you may have already seen this or heard about it. We're affectionately calling it the production to use spectrum. And Yasmin walked us through the top line yesterday. Across the top are the major market players, going from manufacturer down to retail level. And now along the left-hand side, we've taken all those market functions. So across the top, you have market players, and along the side, you have market function. And this allows us a way to collect information by market player according to the market function they're performing or not performing. And the key here is, and I'm going to say this a lot in this presentation, and if there's one thing you all walk away with from this presentation, I want it to be, when we talk about TMA, we're talking about the market players' incentives and capacity to perform or not their key market functions, right? So keep that in mind. I'm going to say it a lot, and hopefully somebody can say it back to me at the end of this presentation. So here we have our market players. When we talk about different market players, there's many different subcategories within these players. And it's very important that as we start to look at our market, this is cookie cutter at the top right now. Your market looks different, and that's the starting point. Are there different aspects to these players in your country? So if we take the example starting with consumers. Within the category of consumers, depending on your health area and your market or your health system, there are different categories of consumers. This is an example from the HIV world, and here you can see the different categories. So it's important for us to understand which consumers are we talking about, and are we talking about all of them? That will inform the information we collect, as well as then, of course, the design. So we can also think of consumers not just by category, but also through here's another way to do segmentation. So it's about bringing, when we think of the word segmentation, we often think of it around price, but we can really bring segmentation and bring the production to use spectrum to life through thinking about consumer segmentation, for example, in family planning through the life stages. Are we talking about pregnant women? We had this conversation yesterday with youth in need. We're talking about married women, and what are their needs? This just brings the richness and complexity to our market analysis. So similarly for providers, there are many different health service delivery components. And I think this is where the production to use spectrum really comes to life in terms of service delivery. I think a lot of people think, oh, production to use, I'm thinking about a product that gets produced at manufacturer level and flows through the supply chain. But it is not just about that, because those products have to be delivered. More often than not, we are talking about clinical service delivery, whether it be in malaria case management, or HIV self-testing, or IUD insertions. There are many service delivery points, and so it's important for us to understand that at the provider level too, and to really start to think, do we care about, we need to know where our SARAs are going for those services. And that happens at many levels. And Sarah doesn't think in terms of the private sector or in terms of pharmacy and drug shop or in public sector. She goes where it's convenient for her, and she may go someplace different for herself than she goes for her child. So similarly for importers, again, you have to consider all the different types of importers that may be present in your country and what they're doing. And of course, this is where PSI starts to come in too, right? It's not just the government importing or frontline buyers. It could easily be PSI, or it could be other NGO partners. So again, thinking about, it's not one group of people importing, but all the different groups. So this is an example from Tanzania in terms of mapping that market and where products first come in and how they flow through the system. And the point of this slide is to demonstrate that in many ways these things aren't linear. As we start to look at how products and subsequent services flow through the system, there can be interactions at different levels. And here in the center, you see wholesalers, retail pharmacies, and NGOs are all playing a sub-distribution kind of role here, right? And it's important to understand how dynamic your market is if we're really going to work effectively in it. We can't just assume things happen in a linear fashion. So further to this, again, when you're customizing the production to use spectrum for your country, think about, for this product and this service, are there both importers and distributors? Maybe they're consolidated. You know, maybe you have some actors that are working as both distributors and wholesalers. So really make sure that when you start on this process, that your production to use chain is customized to your context. So multiple players are involved in influencing the enabling environment, and we understand these along the supporting rules and functions. So now that you have your players across the market, across the top, the next thing to do is to go down and look at the supporting functions, the core functions, and the rules of the market. So if we start at the top, the core market functions are relatively known to PSI. We often classify them in the 4 Ps, right? And these are issues. So collecting this information is something we naturally do, and we have familiarity with, and it's common. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. When we move into the supporting functions, and here you have the subcategories of information, guidance, quality, financing, labor capacity. These are areas that PSI is not typically collecting information in. And it's really important for us to understand how those supporting functions are working in the market or not. What is the importer's capacity and incentives to offer financing, for example? What is a certain provider's labor capacity? Do they have the capacity to do testing, or do they need training? So we need to go through, and the way this is laid out in a matrix is quite nice because it allows us to ask specific questions according to market player and market function. So what we've been doing a bit with Jenny and Navindu and Steve Coyer is to help us think about all the information we need to gather. We've developed questions for each one of these squares, right? For each market player, by each market function, what are the key questions we need to be asking in specific health areas? So we've done this for malaria case management. We've also done it, I'm going to look at Steve. We've also done it for sanitation, I believe. Catherine? That is correct. That is correct. So as you're starting to map your market and understand your market, reach out to Steve, to Catherine, we'll make sure it's on Kix, to John, to look at those key questions that will start to get you thinking, what are the questions I need to be asking by market player and by market function to understand the incentives and the capacity of that market to perform or not. It's important to think when we are talking about the supporting functions, who are the other agencies influencing this? Government comes in, donors and partners, right? So even though the government and donors and partners are not on the top of the production to use spectrum, they do influence the market players' ability or capacity and incentives to perform or not, and we need to consider those when we're reviewing the supporting functions. Similarly for rules often have to do with things like policy, regulations, taxes, and tariffs. Is there an unnecessary tax on the private sector, for example? If the public sector can bring a product in for tax-free because it's a health commodity, why can't the private sector? Not unsurprisingly though, the private sector is often faces heavy taxes for the exact same product. And that's a disincentive for the private sector to help supply that health market. These are issues that we need to understand if we're going to work effectively with the market players. We need to understand their realities. Okay. So that's the process, or the theory, the conceptual component. Basically taking the market system structure and outlining it in a matrix that allows us to really unpack the information we need to make decisions. In terms of actually going through a process to do this, with your country teams, with your technical advisors, with your marketing advisors, we've done this market mapping using this framework in a few countries now and across different health areas. And those have been talked about already in this meeting. So we're going to share some of the feedback. Every time we've done it, I'd say we've followed a different process, right? And the steps in the process are usually the same, but who is doing those steps, whether it be consultants, whether it be led by the country team, the amount of time it takes, has looked different. And I think this portion of the presentation is really going to get at objective 4 for this workshop, which is to bring you all into the discussion. How would doing this market mapping work in your country? How would it work for sanitation, since we're talking about sanitation in your country? We all know that we need funding to do these things. We all have busy schedules and lives with our regular jobs. So we need to think about how do we work effectively together to take a step back and get this information, whether it be before an RFA is launched, in the middle of a project, or even at the end as a way to develop an exit and sustainability strategy. The key activities, the first thing that we want to do is start with a desk review, a literature search. What is all the available literature out there on this topic? That should include primary research, secondary research, grade literature. PSI's own research should be considered in this. What research surveys have your country teams done in this health area? Don't forget that. There's a wealth of information in the surveys we've done. The DC SRE team can also help with literature reviews. You can send them a form and they can collate all the literature available. What we've noticed though is after you do your desk review, you need to start saying where are the information gaps, right? Is there literature on how importers are functioning in this market, in this health area? Most often, the answer is no. There's just not a lot of good published literature on certain players in the market. Public health literature tends to focus on consumer, maybe provider level. So once we've reviewed the literature out there and we know where we don't have any information, we need to supplement it. And this is where we get at the questions that I outlined. So far we've done this through in-depth interviews with our market players. And actually going out, finding them, talking to them in a semi-structured interview way, which the research teams can help you do, to collect that information and supplement the literature so that we can start to put our information into that matrix format, into the production to use, and start to see, do we still have information gaps, right? Or is this a complete picture now of what our market looks like? In terms of the format, you can imagine it would be very hard to put all that dense information, rich information, into a simple matrix, right? It gets very big, and then all of a sudden we're back at our original problem of a 40-page document that sits on a shelf somewhere. So even though we are trying to be objective and map the market and gather all the information we need, we as humans will start to bring a filter to what's really important to put in those squares, right? And we'll get to how to manage that. But it is, I'm just going to lay that out there, is it's a tricky part of this process. What is the most salient information to include versus what's not? Who makes that decision? How do we move from market mapping to market analysis? So right now, and Fred will get into this much more to show how we've done that. I'll just put it out there that one way we've kind of done that is to start to traffic light the matrix then, right? As we collect information, which information is showing us red? Which information is showing, okay, this market it's kind of working, but it's somewhat broken here, right? So as you think about how you're going to do this for your countries and that process, think about the formatting of it as well. We want to hear from you all. What has worked? How have you organized this dense information in a way that can be digested? In terms of steps to achieve this, we found it's incredibly important to have at least one point person who's going to own this information. That person doesn't have to collect all the information nor do all the interviews or even put it in the appropriate format, but somebody has to be the owner of this process. You need to decide within your country team who that will be. And once you do that, because there's a lot of information to go through, we recommend developing a Gantt chart to follow that so it doesn't get lost among all the other activities that you're doing. And to follow that with a lead up to the workshop. We'll talk more about the workshop later this afternoon, which is really the point at which the analysis starts. So in terms of considering who can do this, consider in-country as well as global support teams. So the malaria survival team is here to support you in these health areas. The marketing team is here to support you. Your regional marketing advisor, your regional researcher can also help collate information and bring evidence. So consider these different people in your context for how you would do this for a particular health area, and in particular while we're all here for sanitation. So this is very small, but this is just an example of the information that was collected for Madagascar recently for the malaria case management market along the policy and regulatory supporting or rules function. And I think what this is trying to demonstrate is this is actually a big issue in Madagascar. There's a policy that it happens in a lot of West African countries, in fact, around who can distribute ACTs versus who can do testing. And it's a complexity in the health system in Madagascar and in many countries that if we don't understand that, we're never going to increase access, we're never going to increase use as a percentage of need. So it's very important to understand that. Great. So that's the theory and the process.